Let's talk about asset selection and what constitutes asset selection. We can see here in front of us examples of assets that we've talked about, like files, accounts, financial information, emails, identity, etc. These are good examples of things that might be valued, i.e. assets. These then relate to privacy, anonymity, and pseudo-anonymity, as we've discussed. The assets have security controls, possible vulnerabilities, threats, and adversaries. How we define what are assets will depend on the entity you are trying to protect. So beyond information, data, accounts, devices, you may also want to assign things like functions, departments, processes, and other such things as assets too, because these things are valued too, and if they are exploited, there is an undesirable impact. So for example, if the entity you're trying to secure is a banking application and you are the security architect, the login function for that banking app might be considered an asset. The login function would have security controls like input validation. It would have threats like hackers and adversaries. If you're operating a business, the financial or sales department could be an asset with its own special security controls, threats, and adversaries. Another example in a business, the process of, say, how people are dealt with when they resign and leave the organization could be considered an asset. This leaving process, having the security control, for example, of making sure that people's credentials are removed out of the business system, a very important process when people leave and something that is often forgot in businesses. Information and data, as we've discussed, can also be a way to categorize something as an asset. So data is often assigned as an asset in some way, and that data can often be assigned a classification like secret, confidential, sensitive, or public, and so on. So there are degrees to which security controls need to be applied to that asset based on its classification. How granular you are with assets will depend on the entity being protected. Within the security industry, different organizations provide different recommendations for assigning assets, and this assignment of assets is usually done in the early stages of what is called the risk assessment process, or a risk assessment. For further information, if you want to understand more about risk assessments, you can look at places like SABSA, ISO, particularly ISO 27005, and the Information Security Forum, or just do a search for information security risk assessments and you can see what you can find there. But essentially, we're talking about asset selection, and really you want to pick at the assets that make sense to you, and with experience that will guide you in the end to what are the best assets based on the entity that you are trying to protect.